Good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. My name is Codi and Executive Director of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. And Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we sit down with faith leaders, elected officials, and social justice practitioners to talk at the intersections of faith, climate, and justice. And this morning we have on a very special guest, a friend of Gipple and a faith leader in the Atlanta community, Rabbi Ron Segal of Temple Sinai here in Atlanta. Rabbi, thanks for joining us this morning.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm excited this morning. We're going to talk a little bit about Passover, a little bit about the Shmitta year, a little bit about how congregations can get involved in this work, both on a practical scale at their own congregation and also in policy work. But before we do that this morning, I think that you have a reading to ground us, and so I'll ask you to offer that.
Sure. Of the sources in Jewish tradition that I could turn to for this, and there are many, I'm offering the familiar story which comes from our oral tradition known as the Talmud. There is a tale that may be familiar to many about a man by the name of Honi, who walking along the road one day found a gentleman who was planting a carob tree. And it was an elderly gentleman, and Honi asks the man planting the carob tree, sir, you are already advanced in age. Do you really expect to see the fruit of this tree in your lifetime? To which the gentleman replied, I was born into a fruitful world with trees that were abundant, that had been planted by the generations before me. And so it is my responsibility and obligation to plant for those who will come after me. And that simple narrative, that simple tale is one which communicates this value and lesson that, we don't live in a world in which we are only responsible for the time that we have here. We have to really reflect upon and think about what have we inherited and what are we going to leave to those that will follow. And that tale is shared with some regularity, because I think it's such an important message to understand that this is the world we have, and we want to leave something for our children that is going to be sustainable and healthy. So,
yeah, thank you so much for that. In a world where so much is dominated by the individual and what is best for me, to sort of use our faith to refocus on the community that then refocuses us to the earth is
assuredly, yeah,
pretty important. Rabbi, I wonder, before we dive into what's going on at your particular synagogue, I want to ask you your journey on this this path towards combining sort of doing the work of being a rabbi and also diving into the work of advocacy and the work of caring for creation, and how that came about for you.
Well, admittedly, I would be relatively new to this journey, not from a perspective of learning from our tradition about the importance of care for the earth. Certainly, that is a value that we communicate with regularity whenever we're studying throughout the year at particular times. But in terms of my own increased interest and desire to learn more and to become a little bit more engaged in the effort, it was born out of, honestly, some conversations with others in our community, others who are active with Gipple, and as well as leaders in our congregation, whose own journeys and passions just spoke to me in ways that I found particularly touching and motivating. So much so that this past Holy Days, I dedicated my Rosh Hashanah sermon to this topic, and from that, it really has just continued to sort of expand a level of interest within the congregation, as well as my own desire to continue to read and learn more, and to find ways of mobilizing the members of our community. So, making decisions within the congregation to try and, further green our community, if you will, to trying to be more intentional about things we do at home, to trying to looking forward to making decisions about what we drive and how we live. All of those things are really just emerging in our life, and excited to see if that will continue to develop. So new to this journey, but excited to be part of it.
Yeah, well, very excited to have you along on the journey. Your congregation and you yourself have talked about kind of the importance of advocacy work, not only the practices that you're doing in your congregation, but trying to get at some of these systemic injustices. I know that you helped to work on the Faith Leader Sign-On letter for the Okefenokee Swamp. Your congregation has been involved in getting educated to prepare for the legislative session, which we just came out of, but also now we're looking towards the IRP and the rate case and thinking about energy and how do we get towards a clean energy economy, who pays for it, how do we make sure that those who are most at risk get the benefits that they need from transitioning off of fossil fuel sources, all these different things. But ultimately, why is the advocacy piece important for you, and how has it been trying to get your congregation and others in the community to participate at that level?
Well, I think advocacy for most, not just the members of our community, I think advocacy for most is the hardest thing to mobilize people around. And yet we realize it's the most important, because making decisions which are life choices, which will reduce our carbon footprint, which will, on an individual level, hopefully continue to combine to make a difference, are important. But unless we are able to inspire individuals to understand that if we don't make the systemic changes that really impact the largest producers of fossil fuels and companies, that our capacity to make the kind of difference that our tradition would compel us to is going to be more limited. So education around that idea, bringing in stories that help people relate to the reality of it, bringing people to places where they can see the impact of the environment, engaging them in things in nature, in all sorts of ways that help people appreciate and understand the beauty of the earth and its and the imperative that we have to try and protect it. I think all of those things can help people touch a chord and spark a desire to raise a voice and to speak out and to contact our elected officials when there is legislation that they feel that will truly make a difference. It's again, people are conflict avoiders by nature, right? And advocacy, I think some associate with being rooted in conflict. So getting people to get past that discomfort and to be willing to write or to pick up the phone is, I think, something that we're going to continue to try and mobilize more people to do. But we were successful with the Okefenokee because of the way we tried to do education and plus the passion of some of the members of our community really spoke to others. So hopefully we'll find ways of continuing to do that.
Definitely. Well, there are a lot of people who would say, what's the purpose? What authority does a faith leader have in messing around in politics or in the political sphere or in advocacy? And I think that those people are wrong and misinformed, but I'm curious for you, how do you approach that? And why do you think it's important for faith leaders to be involved in this level and in this kind of work?
Well, the distinction between what is politics and what is faith and religion and morality is certainly a question that we always have to ask. And in terms of making decisions where we choose to raise our voice and when not to, for me, and I'd like to believe for most faith leaders, it has to be rooted firmly and solidly in the tenets of our tradition. And where Judaism is concerned, there is no question about the imperative to care for the earth. Beginning in Genesis, going all the way through oral traditions. There are bodies of work in what we call midrash or interpretive tradition, all of which affirm, our responsibility to care for the earth. This beautiful teaching, which comes from this midrash to the book of Ecclesiastes. God is speaking to humankind and says, speaking to Adam, it says, look at this beautiful earth. Look at this world that I've given you. Be sure to care for it, because if you destroy it, there will be no one after you, right? There will be no one after you to care for it, to replace it. So understanding the reality that where Jewish tradition is concerned, there is no way of absenting ourselves from this conversation, gives, I think, all of us, and I think faith leaders of every tradition, the ability to raise our voice and say, this is not about a political debate. This is about caring for God's creation. This is about understanding that we have one earth and we need to do everything we can to preserve it for generations to come. So for me, where the environment is concerned, it's one of the clearest and easiest arguments to make. And I find that, so far, it has been of the many issues that we will try and talk about from time to time. It has been one of the issues that I've gotten the least amount of pushback on. So sure. Hopefully that will continue to be the case.
We've talked a lot about kind of what the tradition says about caring for the earth in particular, and sort of this original command to care for the creation. Uh-huh. I wonder how justice for community ties into that. Are there things in the tradition that ties both this command to take care of the created world with sort of justice for neighbor, and how do those things intersect?
Well, sure. If we look at the commandments or the laws in the book of Leviticus, or really throughout the Torah and throughout our tradition, care for the least fortunate amongst us is the most oft repeated command in all of Jewish tradition. And where it involves the environment, the agricultural laws of when one harvests their fields or their crops, to not harvest all the way to the corners, to leave the things which fall in our vineyards, which fall to the ground for those who are the neediest amongst us, to be able to gather produce, to be able to provide for themselves. So equitable farming and justice in the care for the environment is absolutely part of that. It ties very much into the ways that people are observing the Shmitta year, which we could talk about a little bit if you wish, or ways that we participate in food drives and hunger efforts. So justice and the pursuit of justice in our community remains probably the greatest priority we have, and certainly the way we care for the earth, and the way we follow practices and support efforts around farming and around harvesting and around distribution of those resources is something which is absolutely a priority and significant with regard to environmental work and environmental justice, for sure.
Yeah, it's difficult, it seems, to find a real story or tale or text that doesn't have sprinkled within it the land or justice and how those things intersect together. And I was gonna cue you up for the Shmitta year, but please continue with what you were gonna say, and then tell us a little bit about that.
I was at a conference last week in California, and during that trip, we visited an active working, I would say, Jewish justice farm, Coastal Roots Farm Encinitas. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it.
Cool.
An inspiring, really inspiring place that practices everything from regenerative agriculture to equitable, food distribution, to environmental education. It's on 17 acres of land, and the Shmitta year has provided a beautiful way of sort of bringing all of that together, even though they operate year round. But the Shmitta year is commanded in Exodus. It says for 6 years, just like for Shabbat, the Sabbath in the Jewish tradition, on the seventh day, we're commanded to rest. Same holds for the land, that 6 years you work your land, you till it and farm it. But on the seventh year, you're to let the land lay fallow. The commandment really is applicable within the land of Israel, according to the book of Exodus and Torah. But during that year, there is this obligation to ensure that the produce which grows naturally is distributed to all of those who are in need, and most who are going hungry and unsure of where the next meal is coming from. Here in the United States and throughout the rest of the world, though not obligated by the specific laws of Shmitta, that's the Hebrew word which refers to this seventh year of rest, there is this way of applying those lessons of how do we understand the cycles of the land, and how do we allow this seventh year, of which we're in the middle of right now. It started at Rosh Hashanah and will go to the next new year. How do we take this time period to focus on the earth, to focus on education, to ensure that we are understanding the limitations of the environment and the need to practice regenerative agriculture and regenerative energy, and to look at all of the ways that we can try and change and improve, the way we are, or limit, I guess I would say, the way we are exhausting our resources. All of those, I think, are rooted really, really deeply in this concept of Shmitta. It provides a beautiful way of providing, an educational frame for this year.
That's a wonderful thing to have in the tradition, because it demands pay attention, focus, think about planning. How do you, it highlights all of those questions throughout the year, which I think is really interesting and valuable. Yeah. Passover is coming up here soon, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you before we get deep into that season. But wanted to hear a little bit about how, in particular, this holy season connects to some of these larger themes. Both, what does it mean to have these rituals in the midst of the Shemitah year? And then moving beyond that, what are ways in which, Passover connects to these themes of justice and the environment?
Well, there are 3 what we call pilgrimage festivals in Judaism, Passover being one of them, the other 2 Sukkot, and then the festival known as Shavuot. And in their origins, and all of this is found within the Bible as well, all of them were agricultural festivals. So if we look back to, the beginnings of our people for thousands of years, these holidays, these festivals were very much rooted in the seasons of the agricultural year, from the planting to the harvesting, to the first fruits that would grow. All of them revolve around that agricultural season. Passover is the beginning of that agricultural year. Here we find ourselves in spring with the planting, and when we look at the narrative and the story of the Exodus, which is familiar to so many, there are ways of, if we really want to apply an agricultural or an environmental theme to them, it provides a wonderful way of really doing some great teaching and looking at the story through a lens that can be quite educational. For example, we're familiar with the plagues and the plagues that fall upon all Egypt. But if we think about what they are through an environmental lens, what is the first thing that is impacted? It's the water, right? And if you recall, the frogs emerge from the water and they fill the land. Well, because the water becomes poisoned in some respects. What is it that we're doing to, if you will, to infect our streams that is leading to, right? So it's easy to see there's a connection there. We could talk about the extreme weather, the hail that falls and, and pummels and destroys the land. And my goodness, how much have weather extremes and disasters been part of our world, especially this past year, but in years past. And so to be able to see, even through our own experiences, how these ancient narratives, those are just a couple of the examples. We could look at each of the plagues. How are we enslaved, if you will, to, to overuse of our fossil fuels or whatever it may be, right? So there are great opportunities to take the lessons of this festival and to really look at them through an environmental lesson and through environmental lens is what I meant to say. So
that's perfect. Well, thank you so much, Rabbi, for coming on the show and giving us some of your time this morning. I've got one final question for you, and then I won't take too much more of your time.
Okay.
There's a lot going on in the world, and specifically when we think about climate and the IPCC reports or the data that we see, the sort of alarm bells ringing all the time. We're on the cusp of hurricane season and wildfire season and all these horrible natural rhythms that have expanded and now remind us every year about how bad things are getting and how time is running out. And so it would be easy for people to slip into despair. And so my question for you is, what gives you hope to anchor yourself in this work and not ignore the signs that are happening all around, but sort of gain the courage to take the next step on the work that we know that has to be done?
I think that, first of all, in Jewish tradition, they say we're prisoners of hope, right? The concept of tikva, which is the Hebrew word for hope, is something which finds its way into every aspect of Jewish life. There is certainly ample reason for despair in so many pockets of the world. And yet that can't be the path that we choose to walk. Yesterday I took 25 seniors from our community to the Atlanta Botanic Gardens. Unlike today, it was a glorious, glorious day. And we were walking into Starza Woods, and we were on the canopy walk in the Atlanta Botanical Gardens. The canopy walk, which opened like six years ago or so. And the docent who was leading us was wise to point out that this spectacular canopy walk through the forest is designed in a way in which the impact to the forest floor is minimal. There are these two pillars and suspension mechanisms which have impacted the forest floor almost minimally. And I thought about that in the context of, a sense of hope that with the idea, with creativity and with ingenuity and with intention, we can continue to advance and move forward and to make a difference and to serve our communities in ways that do not have to destroy or completely deplete the world and the resources in which we have. It just takes the right kind of intention and focus and commitment. And I believe that if people understand our imperative, and if we continue to ensure the right kind of education and motivation and aspiration and creativity and opportunities for difference making are made clear, that people will understand that even though it's bleak, right? And even though there's a sense of urgent need, that individual choices do matter, and that we can, with the right focus, make a difference. So
Yeah.
all of that, I think, is rooted in our tradition, but also rooted in all of our traditions, and certainly in Jewish life, that is a message that we will always continue to teach.
I'm so grateful for you and for that, and that everybody who's watching, that we might all commit to be a little more creative in a way that makes us move in the world in a way that we should. Rabbi Segal, thank you so much for coming on the show, and blessings to you and blessings to Temple Sinai as you continue this work.
Thank you very much, Cody. It was an honor to spend some time together.
Great. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks for another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks.